The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable in the air. A sea of faces filled the room, all eyes fixed on the judge as he prepared to hear another tedious set of testimonies. But today, something was different. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd as Clint Eastwood entered the courtroom. Clint wasn't the Clint Eastwood that everyone knew from the silver screen, the cowboy, the tough-as-nails actor who made a living out of intense stares and iconic one-liners. No, today Clint was different. He was dressed in a dark gray suit, his hair neatly combed, his face calm, but behind his steely gaze, there was a history that no one in this courtroom could even begin to fathom. As he took his seat, the air seemed to thicken, the weight of his presence subtly unnerving. He wasn't here for a role in a movie or a photo op. He wasn't here as a celebrity guest either. No, Clint Eastwood was sitting in the defendant's witness stand for a case that had nothing to do with Hollywood, fame, or fortune. It had everything to do with security, secrets, and a life that was lived behind the closed doors of the U.S. Secret Service. The judge, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze, glanced down at his paperwork, his lips curling slightly as he looked at Clint's name. He couldn't help but let out a chuckle. Clint Eastwood, huh? He muttered under his breath, clearly amused by the coincidence. He glanced at the defendant. I'm assuming this is some sort of joke, right? A Hollywood actor coming in to testify in court, this is the kind of thing you see in movies, not real life. The room fell into an awkward, uncomfortable silence. The judge's smirk remained on his face, though no one was quite sure whether it was because he thought Clint was an actor trying to pull some stunt or because he genuinely believed Clint was just another celebrity getting mixed up in a legal mess. The other lawyers, members of the jury, and the audience, everyone was a little confused, but also intrigued. Clint sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked up at the judge, but he didn't say anything. No matter how amusing the judge found it, Clint had been in situations much worse than this, far more dangerous. Courtrooms weren't exactly unfamiliar territory for him, but this wasn't the type of case he was used to dealing with. He'd spent his life in the shadows, under the radar, and even though he was well known in some circles, few people truly understood his role in the U.S. Secret Service. Few people understood that Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man who had starred in action films, he was also a man who had saved lives, protected the most powerful people in the world, and kept secrets that could have toppled governments. His role in the Secret Service was one that even some of the most high-ranking individuals in Washington, D.C. couldn't fathom. He wasn't just a bodyguard or a field agent. He had been trained in the art of survival, negotiation, and most importantly, discretion. Every move he made was calculated. Every decision was made with the knowledge that the safety of the nation, and in many cases, the world, was on his shoulders. But here he was, sitting in a courtroom, being stared at like a celebrity who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. To the world, Clint Eastwood was an actor. But to Clint, the world had no idea who he really was. The judge cleared his throat, still amused by the situation. Well, Mr. Eastwood, I suppose we'll have to get down to business. Tell me, what exactly are you doing here? The question, though somewhat dismissive, was a fair one. Clint had been subpoenaed as a witness in a case involving national security, a case that had to do with a breach at a high-security government facility. The defendants were accused of espionage, and it was Clint's testimony that could either seal their fate or change the course of the trial altogether. Clint took a deep breath before responding. His voice was steady, calm, even a little detached, as if he were speaking to an old acquaintance. I'm here to tell you what I know about the situation. Nothing more, nothing less. I'm not a star in a film, Your Honor. I'm here to give you the facts. The judge leaned back in his chair, still processing the gravity of the situation, though he seemed to think it was all some kind of elaborate ruse. He glanced at the defense attorney and then back at Clint, the wheels in his mind still spinning. I must say, the judge started again, his tone a little less mocking, this is certainly an unusual case. But I'll humor you, Mr. Eastwood. Proceed. Just as Clint was about to speak again, a lawyer from the defense side stood up, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, I must ask, is this man even qualified to be here? A man who is, by all accounts, a movie actor, and—" The judge raised a hand, silencing the defense lawyer. "I'm not questioning his credentials, counsel. I'm asking him to testify. We'll move on." The tension in the room escalated. As Clint began to speak, giving detailed accounts of the case and how it connected to national security, the room seemed to shift. People began listening. They weren't looking at Clint the actor anymore, they were starting to see him for who he really was. Clint's words were sharp and calculated. He spoke with precision, recounting everything he knew about the espionage operation and the connections between various political figures, international agents, and the criminals behind the breach. He didn't flinch when he described classified information, nor did he seem fazed by the weight of the questions being asked. His voice remained as steady as the calm before a storm. But there was one thing no one could ignore, the certainty in his eyes. As Clint finished his statement, a cold chill ran through the courtroom. The judge, who had initially laughed at the absurdity of Clint being in the courtroom, was no longer smiling. His earlier chuckle faded into a stunned silence. He glanced over at the defense attorney, then back at Clint. And in that moment, the judge realized that the man sitting before him wasn't just Clint Eastwood, the actor. He was Clint Eastwood, the U.S. Secret Service agent, a man with access to the most secretive parts of the American government, a man who had risked his life more times than anyone could count. The judge froze. The room went dead silent. And in that moment, everyone understood something. They had just witnessed something far bigger than they had ever expected. This wasn't a courtroom drama. This wasn't just another celebrity cameo. This was the real thing. The weight of Clint's identity hit the judge like a ton of bricks. He had just unknowingly mocked one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the country. And now, everything had changed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The room remained frozen. The judge's face had turned pale, his earlier smirk now completely gone, replaced by a look of shock and realization. His hands shook as he shuffled through his papers, trying to regain some semblance of composure. It wasn't every day that someone like Clint Eastwood sat in front of him, especially not under these circumstances. Clint, on the other hand, remained as still as ever. His stoic expression had not wavered an inch since the moment the judge had first mocked him. The truth was, Clint had been in situations far more dangerous than this, situations where his life had been on the line. A courtroom was a relatively tame environment compared to some of the places he had been, some of the things he had seen. As the judge cleared his throat, Clint couldn't help but wonder how many people in this room even knew who he really was. Not the actor, not the tough guy on screen, but the man who had spent over 2 decades in the U.S. Secret Service, working undercover, protecting the president, and dealing with the kind of international threats that most people would never even dream of. The man who had watched as history unfolded right in front of him, and who had quietly walked away from it all, preferring to keep his secrets buried in the shadows. Growing up in San Francisco, Clint had never imagined that his life would take such an unexpected turn. He had always been a quiet, reserved child, one who preferred reading books about history and politics to playing with other kids. It wasn't until after high school, when his father, an ex-military man, told him that he had a knack for strategy and discipline, that Clint's path was set. He joined the army straight out of high school and quickly rose through the ranks, his keen mind and sharp instincts catching the attention of his superiors. It wasn't long before he was recruited by the U.S. Secret Service. The agency was looking for individuals who could blend into any environment, gather intelligence, and remain calm under pressure. Clint's background in the military made him a perfect candidate. But it wasn't just his skills that made him stand out, it was his ability to remain unnoticed, even in the most tense situations. As a member of the Secret Service, Clint was often on the front lines of national security. He had protected presidents, traveled the world, and had been a part of countless covert operations. Yet, despite the high-profile nature of his work, Clint had always maintained a low profile. His colleagues knew him as a reliable, no-nonsense agent, but outside of that world, he was a mystery. No one knew Clint Eastwood's real story, except for those who had worked with him directly. But now, as he sat in this courtroom, under the harsh glare of the lights, Clint realized that all of his carefully guarded secrets were about to be revealed. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, not because he feared for his safety, but because he knew what the consequences could be. If the wrong people learned too much, everything he had worked for could come crumbling down. The defense attorney, still visibly flustered, stood up again. "Your Honor, I think it's time we clarify something," the lawyer said, trying to regain control of the situation. "We were under the impression that Mr. Eastwood was here as a witness in a civil case. Yet, it seems he has other qualifications. Are we to believe that he is in some way connected to national security?" The judge, still in shock, looked at Clint. "Is this true, Mr. Eastwood? Are you really?" Clint gave a small nod. "I am a special agent with the U.S. Secret Service. I'm here because this case involves national security matters that fall under my jurisdiction. I am here to provide the necessary information, and I will not be answering any questions beyond that." The room fell silent once more. The defense attorney seemed to stumble back into his chair, unsure of how to proceed. The judge, still trying to process this revelation, glanced at his colleagues, who were equally stunned by the turn of events. No one knew how to react. But Clint was used to this. The Secret Service had always operated in the shadows, and Clint had been one of its most trusted agents for years. He had witnessed firsthand the complex world of espionage, the world where lives were bargained for, secrets and loyalty meant everything. But Clint had never wanted to be in the limelight. He had always done his job with discretion, quietly slipping in and out of dangerous situations without anyone noticing. Now, as a civilian, he had to contend with the repercussions of that secrecy. The judge, his voice trembling slightly, finally spoke. "So, Mr. Eastwood, if you're truly a U.S. Secret Service agent, why are you here? Why aren't you back in Washington, working on something more important?" Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes cold and piercing. "Because this case is important, Your Honor. There are forces at play here that go beyond what you can see. There's more at stake than what you're being told. If I'm here, it's because I need to be." The judge paused, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. His mind raced as he tried to understand the implications of what Clint was saying. But no matter how he tried to spin it, there was no denying it, the man sitting in front of him was far more than just a witness in a trivial civil case. Clint Eastwood, the man who had once been an icon in Hollywood, was now someone who commanded a level of respect that could not be ignored. Clint's eyes never left the judge's face as he spoke again, his voice steady, but firm. "You can laugh at me, you can mock me, but when the facts come to light, you'll understand why I'm here. And when that happens, you won't be laughing anymore." The courtroom remained tense, every person in that room now fully aware that this was no ordinary trial. There was a greater game being played here, one with stakes higher than anyone had anticipated. And Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent years in the shadows, was the one holding the cards. As the judge regained his composure and motioned for the next witness to take the stand, Clint's thoughts drifted back to the life he had left behind. He had left the Secret Service years ago, but that didn't mean the job was over. The work was never done. And now, as the past began to catch up with him, he wondered just how deep the rabbit hole would go. He would find out soon enough. And when the truth was revealed, nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating now. Clint could feel every pair of eyes on him, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on his shoulders. Even though he had dealt with far more dangerous situations in his career, whether it was on a covert mission or protecting the president himself, this was different. This was not about life or death. This was about something else, something far more insidious. The judge, who had regained a small degree of composure, glanced at the defense attorney, who was still trying to piece together his thoughts after the revelation that Clint was a U.S. Secret Service agent. The lawyer hesitated before standing up again, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we're dealing with classified information here. Mr. Eastwood is not the kind of person who should be testifying in this courtroom. His connections to national security, this is beyond the scope of what we're supposed to be discussing today. We need to consider the possibility that this case is being manipulated by outside forces." Clint could see the lawyer's frustration. He could feel the pressure mounting as the stakes grew higher with each passing second. But there was no turning back now. He had to see this through, no matter how dangerous it became. The judge took a long breath before speaking, his voice firm but cautious. "I understand your concerns, counsel, but we've already come this far. Mr. Eastwood, I'm going to allow you to continue your testimony. But know this, anything you say here will be scrutinized. And if there's any indication that we're crossing into territory that's too sensitive, I will stop the proceedings immediately." Clint nodded, his face a mask of calm. He was used to working under pressure. It was something he had done for years, whether it was a covert mission in a foreign country or facing down a room full of armed criminals. He knew how to keep his cool when everything seemed to be falling apart around him. He stood up, adjusting his tie, and began speaking once more. His words were measured, deliberate, and full of authority. "This case is about much more than what you've been told," Clint began, his voice carrying across the room. "The breach at the government facility wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just a couple of rogue agents trying to make a quick buck. This goes all the way to the top." A collective gasp spread through the room. People leaned forward, eager to hear what Clint would say next. He had their attention now, and he wasn't about to lose it. "Whoever is behind this has a much larger agenda," Clint continued. "They want to destabilize our government, not just in Washington, but all over the world. The information they got their hands on, those are the kinds of secrets that could change everything. This isn't just about espionage. This is about control." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier skepticism about Clint's involvement in the case was now replaced with a growing sense of unease. He had been skeptical of Clint's background, but the things he was hearing now were hard to ignore. The implications were staggering. Clint's eyes scanned the room. He could see the disbelief on some faces, the doubt, but he also noticed something else, a flicker of recognition from one or two of the jurors. They were starting to understand that Clint wasn't just a bystander in this case. He was at the very heart of it. The deeper this went, the more dangerous it became. "Your Honor, I'm not here to entertain you with stories of my past or try to impress anyone with my credentials," Clint said, his voice growing more serious. "I'm here because I know the stakes. I've seen the faces of those who would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. And trust me when I say that if we don't act now, we may be too late to prevent a catastrophe." The courtroom was dead silent. Clint's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, their meaning settling over everyone present. The defense attorney was quiet now, no longer trying to argue, no longer trying to dismiss Clint's role in the case. The other lawyers were exchanging uneasy glances, realizing just how high the stakes had become. The judge finally broke the silence, his voice low and serious. "Mr. Eastwood, you've made your point. But this is far bigger than just you or me. If what you're saying is true, then we have a much larger problem on our hands. And if we're going to get to the bottom of this, we need to proceed carefully." Clint nodded. "I agree. The last thing we need is to rush into this without understanding the full scope of what we're dealing with. But we don't have the luxury of time." As the room processed what had just been revealed, Clint couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease in the pit of his stomach. The more he spoke, the more it became clear that he wasn't just involved in a case anymore, he was in the middle of something far more complicated, something that could affect the lives of millions of people. For years, Clint had kept his involvement with the U.S. Secret Service hidden, both from the public and from those closest to him. He had lived in the shadows, working quietly and efficiently behind the scenes. But now, with the truth out in the open, Clint knew that his life would never be the same again. The defense attorney, now fully aware that the tide had turned against them, sat back in his chair, defeated. The judge, while still trying to process everything, signaled to the bailiff to bring in the next set of witnesses. Clint had made his statement. And now, the real game was about to begin. As the proceedings continued, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The case, with all its twists and turns, had already attracted the attention of some very powerful people. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized that this was no longer just a courtroom battle, it was the beginning of a much larger war. A war that he would have to fight in the shadows once again. And this time, there would be no going back. As Clint sat back in his chair, the air in the courtroom felt thick with tension. The once orderly proceedings had now taken on the feel of something far more dangerous. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, the silent judgment, the curiosity, and the fear. But he didn't flinch. He was used to pressure, to being under scrutiny. He had lived with it his entire life. The Secret Service had prepared him for moments like this. But this wasn't just another case, another mission. This was something different. Clint knew that the more he revealed, the more he put everyone in this room at risk. The forces that had already begun moving behind the scenes were far more powerful than any courtroom drama. They were shadowy figures, hidden in the depths of the government and international intelligence communities, pulling strings without anyone even realizing it. The judge called the next witness, but Clint's mind wasn't on the trial. His thoughts were racing. He couldn't help but think back to his time in the Secret Service. Back then, the dangers had been clear. Protecting the president had been straightforward. You knew who the enemy was, and you did whatever it took to stop them. But now, Clint wasn't just dealing with external threats. He was tangled in a web that could implicate people in the highest echelons of power. Clint glanced over at the defense table. The attorney who had been grilling him earlier was now nervously flipping through his notes, his face pale, as if trying to prepare for the worst. The lawyer knew he had underestimated Clint's role in the case, but now there was no going back. The attorney's challenge wasn't just with Clint, but with the forces that Clint had unwittingly brought into play. The next witness was brought forward, but Clint's mind wasn't on them either. His thoughts kept returning to one simple question: who was behind this? Who had orchestrated this whole situation? Why had the breach at the government facility happened in the first place? And why had he been dragged into it? His phone vibrated in his pocket, a subtle reminder that there were things going on outside the courtroom that needed his attention. He had to be careful, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. He had made a promise to himself when he left the Secret Service years ago that he would live a quiet life, away from the chaos. But the moment he stepped foot into that courtroom, he knew that promise was broken. Whatever was coming next, Clint had no choice but to face it head-on. The clock on the wall ticked away, but Clint didn't hear the passing time. Instead, his mind was racing back to his last covert operation, one that had ended with a messy trail of lies, dead ends, and a deep cover that had left him with few allies. There were whispers, rumors about a clandestine group within the government, individuals so powerful that they could pull the strings of policy without anyone noticing. His thoughts were interrupted as a man approached the witness stand. The man was older, graying at the temples, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. The moment Clint saw him, a chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just any witness. This was someone from Clint's past. Someone he had hoped never to see again. The man took the stand, his presence commanding attention. The defense attorney hesitated, clearly thrown off by the sudden appearance of this figure. The judge, too, seemed unsettled. He glanced at Clint, who was now standing, his body tense. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice smooth, yet tinged with something dark, "I'm here to testify on behalf of the defendant, but I must warn you, the information I hold is not for the faint of heart." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He knew this man. This was Daniel Cruz, a former intelligence officer who had been involved in some of the darkest operations Clint had ever been a part of. Cruz had been responsible for overseeing covert surveillance, and Clint had worked with him on several high-profile cases. But Cruz had disappeared after an operation went south, leaving behind a trail of questions and very few answers. Now, Cruz was here, and that meant one thing: this case was about to take a very dangerous turn. The judge motioned for Cruz to continue, though his expression was unreadable. The courtroom fell silent as Cruz adjusted his glasses and began speaking. "I've seen things," Cruz said, his tone cold and detached. "Things that you can't unsee. Things that are bigger than what you're all discussing here today. The breach in the government facility wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a carefully orchestrated move, designed to draw attention away from something far more critical." Clint felt a knot tighten in his chest. Cruz's words sent a ripple through the room. The defense attorney looked like he had just swallowed a mouthful of gravel. The judge, who had been calm up until now, was clearly rattled by the gravity of what Cruz was suggesting. "You've been involved in this, haven't you, Mr. Eastwood?" Cruz continued, his eyes briefly flicking to Clint before he quickly returned to his speech. "You were a key player in this operation. The pieces are all there, if you're willing to see it." Clint's pulse quickened. He had hoped that the past would stay buried, but it seemed that hope was in vain. Cruz had just opened the floodgates to a part of Clint's life he had tried to leave behind. The truth was, Clint hadn't been just an agent, he had been a key part of something bigger, something so classified that even he didn't fully understand it at the time. Cruz's voice echoed in the silent courtroom. "Mr. Eastwood, like me, you know exactly who is pulling the strings. The question is, are you going to stay in the shadows, or are you going to do something about it?" The words hung in the air, and Clint could feel the weight of the entire room pressing down on him. His thoughts raced as he tried to process the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just dealing with an old enemy, he was staring down a conspiracy that stretched across the highest levels of government and intelligence. The moment was a turning point. Clint knew that the game had changed. There was no more hiding, no more playing it safe. He was in this now, whether he wanted to be or not. As the courtroom murmured in shock, Clint stood tall, his eyes never leaving Cruz. The old man may have thought he was in control, but Clint knew better. If Cruz thought this was over, he was gravely mistaken. Clint wasn't done yet. The storm was just beginning. And in this game, he would be the one who decided how it ended. The courtroom buzzed with an uncomfortable energy, the air thick with whispered speculation. Clint's mind was no longer focused on the proceedings. He had been thrust into something far bigger than just a courtroom drama. Cruz's unexpected appearance, along with his cryptic words, had opened a door Clint had hoped would remain closed forever. The memories of past operations and the dark web he had once navigated now rushed back, faster than he could keep up with. For a moment, Clint considered walking out. He could turn around, exit the courtroom, and leave the tangled mess behind. But he knew that wasn't an option. Cruz wasn't here by accident. This was all part of a larger game, and Clint had just become the central piece. He glanced around the courtroom. The judge was still trying to regain control, but the damage had already been done. The defense attorney, who had once been confident in their case, was now visibly rattled, his hands shaking as he adjusted his papers. The prosecution, meanwhile, appeared calm on the surface, but Clint could see the underlying tension in their eyes. They hadn't expected this either. The truth was, no one had. But Clint couldn't afford to be distracted. He had a job to do. He had to figure out what Cruz was up to, and more importantly, what he knew about the conspiracy that had been slowly closing in around him. With a deep breath, Clint turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request a private session with the court. There are matters at hand that cannot be addressed in front of a public audience. The judge gave him a long, considering look. It was a fair request, but the last thing Clint needed right now was to draw more attention to himself. Still, he couldn't ignore the urgency of the situation. The game had changed, and he had to adapt quickly. I'll allow it, the judge finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. But this better not turn into another spectacle, Mr. Eastwood. Clint nodded and rose from his seat. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, but he didn't let it shake him. He knew exactly where this would lead, and he had to be the one to steer it in the right direction. As he walked to the back of the courtroom, the defense attorney tried to catch his eye, but Clint ignored him. The other lawyers whispered in hushed tones, undoubtedly trying to make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. Clint made his way to a small, private room behind the courtroom, where the judge, the defense attorney, and the prosecution followed him. The door closed behind them, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Mr. Eastwood, this is highly irregular, the judge began, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. What exactly are you trying to say here? You've just dropped a bombshell in front of everyone, and now you want to handle this behind closed doors. Clint didn't flinch. He wasn't here to explain himself. He was here to take control of the narrative. Cruz didn't just walk in here by coincidence, Clint said, his voice steady. He's part of something much bigger. I don't know if he's working with someone or if he's trying to get ahead of a situation, but what he said about the operation, it's true. There's a bigger game at play here. And I'm in the middle of it. The defense attorney snorted, clearly skeptical. You expect us to believe that? You're the one who's been involved in classified operations, Mr. Eastwood. And now you're telling us that you're caught in the middle of some conspiracy? Clint turned to face the defense attorney. I'm telling you that the stakes are higher than anything you've been briefed on. There's a shadow operation happening, something far beyond your understanding. It involves people you wouldn't believe, in places you'd never expect. And if we don't act now, we may not have the chance to stop it. The prosecution, who had been silent up until now, spoke. What are you asking us to do, Clint? You're telling us that Cruz is involved in a conspiracy, but how can we proceed without evidence? We've been trying to piece this case together, but you're throwing us into an abyss without a map. Clint took a step forward. I'm not asking you to believe me, but I am asking you to take this seriously. Cruz was involved in high-level operations, ones that, if revealed, could shake the foundations of everything we've built. This isn't about a simple breach at a government facility. It's about national security, about people who have infiltrated every corner of our government. The room fell silent. The weight of Clint's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The defense attorney looked like he was ready to argue, but the judge held up his hand, silencing him. Mr. Eastwood, the judge said, his voice quieter now, you're asking us to believe that you're caught in the middle of a larger scheme. And while I don't know whether I can fully accept that, I do understand that you have more experience in this area than any of us. But what I don't understand is why you didn't come forward with this sooner. Clint sighed, his shoulders sagging for the first time since he had walked into the courtroom. He had expected this question, and it was one he had asked himself 1,000 times. But the answer was simple. He had been trying to stay out of it. To leave his past behind. To live a normal life. But the truth was, there was no such thing as a normal life, when you had been in Clint Eastwood's position. The moment he had decided to walk into that courtroom, the past had come rushing back at him like a tidal wave. I didn't come forward sooner because I didn't think I had to, Clint said, his voice laced with frustration. I thought I could keep it under control, but Cruz's appearance here has forced my hand. The people behind this operation aren't going to stop. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their secrets. And if we're not careful, we could be too late. The prosecution and defense exchanged uneasy glances. The judge stood still, processing what Clint had said. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, each of them weighing the truth of Clint's words. Finally, the judge spoke. "All right. We'll proceed, but under one condition. You'll continue to provide whatever information you can, but if this gets any deeper, we're pulling you out. This court is not equipped to handle matters of national security." Clint nodded. He understood. The weight of the moment settled over him, and he could feel the gravity of the decision bearing down on everyone in the room. He had stepped into something bigger than a court case. He had stepped into a battle that could change everything. But there was no turning back now. The storm was here. And it wasn't going anywhere. Clint sat in the dimly lit room, the silence almost suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the tension so palpable that it seemed to have a weight of its own. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd just set into motion. The stakes had shifted. The game had changed. There was no longer any question about the danger he was in, it had always been there. But now it was more real than ever. The judge had allowed the proceedings to continue with a few stipulations. Clint would cooperate and provide whatever intelligence he could on the shadow operation, but only under the condition that the court didn't step into areas beyond its jurisdiction. The prosecution, clearly on edge, had agreed to the terms reluctantly. But Clint knew better. This wasn't just about legal procedures anymore, this was about something far more dangerous. The defense attorney, having been silenced by the weight of Clint's revelations, had stepped back, looking more like a spectator than a legal representative. There was little he could do now but watch as Clint's words sent ripples through the entire case. No one in the courtroom could deny that something far larger was at play, something that had the potential to bring down the system itself. Clint's gaze flickered across the room, landing on a stack of papers on the desk in front of him. They were the case files, the ones he had been avoiding since the day he was summoned. Each document was a piece of the puzzle, but Clint knew they were incomplete. There was more to this than what anyone in that courtroom had seen. And now it was up to him to make sure they got the full picture. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Clint's hand instinctively reached for the concealed weapon on his belt, but he stopped himself just in time. This wasn't a mission. This was a different kind of battle, one where he couldn't afford to be reckless. A tall, dark-haired man stepped into the room, his sharp eyes scanning the space before landing on Clint. "Eastwood," the man said, his voice low but purposeful. "I see you've stirred up a hornet's nest." Clint didn't rise from his seat. He had seen this man before, though it had been years since their paths had crossed. This was Agent Daniel Carter, a former colleague from the Secret Service, a man Clint had trusted once, but whose loyalties had always been a bit murky. Now, as he stood before Clint, Carter looked more like an enemy than an ally. "What are you doing here?" Clint asked, his tone cautious. He knew Carter wasn't just here for a casual conversation. When it came to the world they both inhabited, every meeting had a purpose, and every word was a calculated risk. Carter's lips curled into a thin smile. "You've made quite an impression, Clint. Cruz's appearance was just the beginning. You've got everyone asking questions, including the people who really pull the strings. They're not happy about you stirring the pot." Clint leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "If they think I'm going to back down now, they're wrong." Carter's expression hardened. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. This is bigger than any one person. You think you can take on these people, these organizations, with a few papers and a gun? This is a system that's been in place for decades. You can't just walk in and disrupt it without consequences." Clint stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He knew Carter was right. This was no longer about one man's mission, it was about an operation that spanned continents, alliances, and factions within the government itself. It was a network of influence that reached into every corner of the intelligence community and beyond. "I know exactly what I'm up against," Clint said, his voice steady but cold. "And I'm not going to let them win. Carter's eyes flickered with something akin to concern, but he quickly masked it. "You'll need help. You can't do this alone." Clint shook his head. "I've always worked alone." "Not this time," Carter replied, stepping closer. "Look, Clint, I came here because I know what's at stake. I've seen the things you've been involved in. And I can tell you that Cruz, he's not the only one out there. There's a whole network of people who have been pulling the strings. And if we don't act quickly, they'll bury you, and everyone else who gets in their way." Clint stared at Carter for a long moment, sizing him up. He didn't trust him, not completely, but Carter was right about one thing: Clint couldn't take on this fight alone. Not anymore. The enemies were too powerful, too entrenched. He needed allies. Whether he liked it or not, he needed Carter. "All right," Clint said, his voice a low murmur. "What's your plan?" Carter gave a grim nod, as if he had been expecting this response. "There's a safe house, nearby, but off the grid. It's the only place we can lay low for now. We need to stay off the radar while we gather more intel and figure out who's pulling the strings behind Cruz's little performance in court." Clint clenched his fists, his mind already processing the details. He had been in situations like this before, dangerous, high-stakes missions where every move mattered. But this time felt different. There was no clear target, no obvious enemy. The web they were dealing with was far more intricate than he had anticipated. He glanced back at Carter, his expression hardening. "What's the catch?" Carter's smile disappeared, replaced by a more serious look. "The catch is that if we're wrong about any of this, if we make one wrong move, the people we're going up against will make sure neither of us ever see the light of day again." Clint stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in. There was no going back now. He had stepped into a game that had no rules, and the only way out was to keep moving forward, no matter what. "I'll do it," Clint said, finally breaking the silence. "But I'm in control of this. Understand?" Carter nodded. "Of course. But just remember, Clint, you may be in control now, but we both know how quickly that can change." Clint didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. As he stepped into the unknown, he knew one thing for certain: he was in deeper than he had ever been before, and this fight was just beginning. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going down without a fight. The dangerous alliance had been forged. And the storm was about to hit. The cold air hit Clint's face as he stepped out of the building, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. Carter followed closely behind him, his presence a silent reminder that Clint wasn't alone in this anymore. They had to move quickly. The longer they stayed in one place, the higher the chances that someone would notice their movements. The streets outside the courthouse were crowded, but Clint barely registered the faces of the people around him. His mind was focused on the task at hand. Every step he took, every move he made, was calculated. This wasn't just another mission, it was the beginning of a fight that could change everything. Carter led the way, guiding Clint toward a black SUV parked on the side of the road. As they approached, Clint felt a familiar sense of unease, the kind that always came when he had to rely on someone else's judgment. But he pushed the feeling aside. There was no time for hesitation. The car door opened, and Carter gestured for Clint to get in. Clint slid into the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings, every detail burned into his mind. They had to be cautious. If they weren't careful, they could easily become targets, just like anyone else who had the misfortune of crossing paths with the people behind Cruz's appearance in court. Carter started the engine, and they drove in silence for several minutes. The city lights blurred past them, but Clint didn't focus on the surroundings. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Cruz. The man had dropped a bombshell in court, and while Clint still didn't know the full extent of Cruz's involvement in the larger operation, there was one thing Clint knew for sure: Cruz was just a pawn. The true masterminds were out there, and Clint had to find them before it was too late. Finally, Carter broke the silence. "We're headed to the safe house," he said, his voice low. "It's off the grid, like I said. We'll have a few hours to lay low, figure out our next move. But we need to act fast. This thing's bigger than just you and me. There are people, powerful people, who don't want this information getting out. If they find out we're investigating Cruz's case, we'll be dead before we even get close to the truth." Clint nodded, but his mind wasn't fully on Carter's words. He was already replaying the events of the courtroom in his head. Cruz's sudden appearance, the way the judge had frozen when he realized Clint's true identity. There was more to it than that. Cruz had said something about the operation, a phrase that stuck in Clint's mind. "They're still watching you, Clint. They know where you've been, and they know what you've done." It wasn't a warning. It was a message. A message that someone out there had been tracking Clint's every move, even after he thought he'd disappeared from the radar. The realization made his stomach churn. Whoever was behind this had been planning for years. And now, they were coming for him. The drive stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Clint glanced over at Carter, who was focused on the road but clearly aware of the tension in the air. "Who are they, Carter?" Clint finally asked, breaking the silence. "The people behind Cruz. Who's pulling the strings?" Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a sharp turn down a narrow alleyway, then another, before pulling into a hidden garage at the back of an old building. The sound of the engine shutting off seemed louder than usual, a sharp reminder that they were entering unknown territory. Once the car was parked, Carter turned to Clint. "I don't know who they are. But I know their reach. These people, they have connections everywhere. Government, military, corporate. They're the ones who've been running things from behind the scenes, the ones who control the narrative. You've seen it in action, look at how easily they infiltrated the court. Cruz was just the tip of the iceberg." Clint's mind raced. There was no way Cruz was the only one involved. It had to be bigger. These shadow players were no ordinary criminals. They were a network of individuals who had learned how to manipulate the system to their advantage. And now, Clint had no choice but to stop them before they moved on to their next target. "We can't waste any more time," Clint said, his voice firm. "We need to find out what Cruz knows, and we need to do it fast." Carter opened his door and stepped out of the vehicle, his eyes scanning the area. "I'll get us set up inside. You can stay here and lay low. No one will find us here." Clint hesitated for a moment but nodded in agreement. He knew the dangers of rushing into things without all the facts. But time was running out, and every second they spent in this safe house brought them closer to the unknown. The walls were closing in, and Clint could feel it. He got out of the car and followed Carter into the building, the heavy door shutting behind them with a dull thud. Inside, the safe house was a stark contrast to the chaos of the city. The dimly lit space was sparse, with only the essentials, furniture, a few computers, and a handful of equipment. "This is where we'll figure out our next move," Carter said, as he began setting up the computers. "I'll start pulling information on Cruz. But we need to be careful. If we're not, we could be walking into a trap." Clint nodded but didn't speak. Instead, he moved to a small window in the corner of the room and looked out at the darkened streets below. He knew the dangers that lay ahead. He had lived through them before, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to stop those who sought to bring chaos to the system. But there was something else gnawing at him. Something deep inside that told him this was all connected to something from his past. The people involved in this, whoever they were, had somehow found their way into his life again. Clint couldn't ignore the feeling that this was a setup, that he had been dragged back into a world he had tried so hard to escape. As the minutes ticked by, Clint's thoughts grew darker. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, the shadow players would close in, and he'd lose his chance to expose them. Carter finished setting up the computers and turned to Clint. "It's time to go to work," he said. "Let's find out who's really behind this." Clint's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. He wasn't backing down now. They had come too far. As the first pieces of information began to appear on the screen, Clint knew that the fight was just beginning. And this time, there would be no turning back. The shadows of his past were closing in, but he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The safe house was silent, save for the soft clicking of keys on the computer and the occasional rustling of papers as Clint sorted through the files Carter had pulled up. Each document felt like a piece of a puzzle, but the picture that began to form was nothing like Clint had anticipated. It wasn't just about Cruz, or even about the courtroom spectacle. No, this went deeper, much deeper. Carter's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, his concentration unwavering. The flickering light from the screen cast a faint glow on his face, revealing the faint lines of age that Clint hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the case that had aged him. This life, this constant fight for survival, had a way of stealing years from a person, one battle at a time. Clint rubbed his eyes, trying to push through the fog of exhaustion that clouded his mind. He needed answers, and he needed them now. But the more he dug into the files, the more confusing it became. There were names he didn't recognize, codes he couldn't crack, and connections that stretched across continents. But one thing was becoming clear: the people behind this weren't just operating on a local level, they were global. They had their hands in everything. "Carter, look at this," Clint called out, leaning forward. The screen in front of him displayed an intricate web of connections, names, dates, locations, and organizations all linked together by a series of encrypted files. Carter stepped over and peered at the screen. His brow furrowed as he scanned the data. This isn't just some rogue operation. These people have influence at the highest levels. Clint nodded, his gut sinking. "Yeah, I've seen this kind of thing before. But I never thought it would be this big." There was a long pause as both men absorbed the gravity of the situation. Every piece of evidence pointed to one disturbing conclusion: this operation wasn't just about illegal dealings or political corruption. It was about power, unfathomable power, and control over the very systems that were supposed to protect people. Governments, military contracts, and intelligence agencies. They were all involved, either willingly or unknowingly, in a massive global network. Clint's hand hovered over the mouse as he clicked on one of the files that was marked as highly classified. The screen flickered, and a new page loaded, this one full of blacked-out text, except for a few lines near the bottom. It read, "Operation Echo." The words seemed to glow against the darkened screen. Clint's pulse quickened as he read on. "Operation Echo is designed to neutralize individuals who pose a threat to the global order. The target list includes high-profile leaders, military figures, journalists, and former agents with sensitive knowledge." Clint's stomach dropped. He had once been a part of that very world, the world where the powerful made decisions that affected millions of lives, a world that didn't ask questions. But the fact that his name might be on some list, alongside some of the most dangerous individuals in the world, sent a chill down his spine. "Carter," Clint whispered, his voice low and heavy. "This isn't just about stopping people like Cruz. It's about eliminating anyone who stands in their way." Carter's face was grim as he studied the screen, processing what Clint had said. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. They're methodical. They don't make moves without careful planning. They've been building this network for years, and now they've set their sights on people like you." Clint clenched his jaw, his eyes hardening. "So, what now? Do we just sit here and wait for them to come after us?" "No," Carter replied, his voice steady. "We fight back. But we have to be smart. If we don't have the right pieces of information, we'll never make it out of this." Clint's fingers tapped on the desk in front of him, a rhythmic motion as he thought about the next step. He knew Carter was right. They couldn't act recklessly, not if they wanted to take down something this big. The operation they were up against had too many layers, and every move had to be calculated with precision. "We need to get to the core of this," Clint said, his voice hard. "We need to find out who's at the top. Who's pulling the strings. And we need to do it without getting caught." Carter nodded, but there was a wariness in his eyes. "The deeper we go, the more dangerous it gets. These people are everywhere. They have eyes and ears in every corner of the world." Clint leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the possibilities. He knew they couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who seemed like allies. It was all too murky. The people behind Operation Echo had perfected the art of manipulation, and they weren't afraid to use anyone to further their goals. "We'll need help," Clint said finally, the realization settling in. "But we have to be careful about who we trust. The wrong person, and it's over." "Agreed," Carter replied. "But we don't have time to waste. We need to act now. If we wait too long, they'll close the net." Clint nodded, and without another word, he stood up. "Let's move out. We'll start with the information we have, and we'll go from there." Carter followed him as they made their way to the back of the safe house. There was a small armory stocked with weapons and other tools they might need. Clint quickly checked his gear, ensuring everything was in place. He knew that no matter how carefully they planned, the odds were stacked against them. But Clint had never been one to shy away from a fight. "We'll hit the ground running," Clint said, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Get to the core, find out who's behind all of this. And shut them down." Carter grabbed his own bag, his expression hard. "Sounds like a plan. But you better be ready for anything. These people don't play fair." Clint gave a small, wry smile. "I've never known them to." As they left the safe house, Clint felt the weight of the situation settle in. He was no longer just a man trying to stay under the radar, he was a man on a mission. And that mission was more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. The road ahead was uncertain, and the shadowy figures pulling the strings were far from easy to reach. But Clint was ready. He wasn't going down without a fight. And with every step, the truth was getting closer. The web was unraveling, and soon, the people behind Operation Echo would have nowhere left to hide. The storm was coming. And Clint Eastwood was ready to face it head-on. The night air was thick with tension as Clint and Carter made their way through the city's backstreets. The sounds of the busy metropolis seemed distant, muffled by the concrete walls of the alleyways they navigated. Each turn, each step, felt like a moment closer to an invisible enemy. Their mission was clear: find the heart of Operation Echo and expose those who thought they were untouchable. But the deeper they dug, the more complicated it became. Clint's mind was still racing from the revelation in the files. The names, the connections, everything pointed to one chilling reality: the people behind this operation had eyes everywhere. Their reach extended far beyond the government and military. They had infiltrated corporations, media, and every level of power imaginable. This wasn't just a covert operation, it was an empire built on control, manipulation, and secrecy. And Clint was now in the center of it. Carter, ever the tactician, kept his head on a swivel as they approached a nondescript building at the end of the alley. It looked like any other old warehouse, but Clint knew better. This was their next stop, an underground network that could potentially lead them straight to the people behind Operation Echo. They paused before entering, checking their surroundings one last time. Clint didn't trust anyone, not anymore. But Carter had proved himself so far, and Clint was willing to take the risk, for now. "This is it," Carter whispered, as he punched a code into the keypad next to the door. The heavy metal door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit staircase leading down into the bowels of the building. Clint took a deep breath, steeling himself. "After you." The two men descended the stairs, the air growing colder as they entered what felt like a subterranean world. The place was eerily quiet, with only the hum of fluorescent lights overhead to break the silence. As they moved further into the depths of the building, Clint's mind raced through the possibilities. This could be a trap. It could be the very place where the shadowy figures behind Operation Echo pulled all their strings. But Clint had no choice but to push forward. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow hallway stretched before them. It was lined with heavy steel doors, each marked with a code. Carter moved quickly, punching in a sequence on one of the doors, and it slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a small room with a few chairs and an old desk covered in files and papers. "This is where we make contact," Carter said, moving to the desk and flipping through the stacks of documents. Clint stayed by the door, his senses alert. The place felt off. It was too quiet, too organized. As if it were waiting for something, or someone. Carter muttered under his breath as he skimmed through the papers. "These are the blueprints. They've been planning this for a long time. I'm talking years. These people, whoever they are pulling off a global operation. And they're getting closer to their final goal." Clint's mind went back to Cruz's warning in court, the cryptic message about the system. Was Cruz a pawn or an unwitting player in a game that was far beyond his understanding? Clint didn't know yet, but he couldn't ignore the fact that Cruz had mentioned something about them knowing where Clint had been. Someone had been tracking his every move. A chill ran down Clint's spine as the realization hit him: there was no safe place anymore. No safe house, no hideaway. Whoever they were always one step ahead. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and Clint spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. His pulse quickened as his eyes scanned the room. But Carter wasn't there anymore. The door that had just closed was no longer the way they had entered. It was a trap. A voice echoed from the shadows. "Clint Eastwood, or should I say, Agent Eastwood." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The voice was cold, calculating. It sent a wave of recognition through him, a face from his past, someone he had never expected to encounter again. Slowly, Clint turned, his hand still hovering near his sidearm. A figure stepped from the darkness, wearing a dark suit, their features partially obscured by the low light. Clint's mind immediately connected the dots. This man had been involved in operations Clint had worked on long ago. A man who had disappeared into the shadows just like Clint had. But the difference was that this man had never stopped playing the game. "Liam," Clint said, his voice low and steady, but his mind was racing. "I should have known you were involved in this." Liam smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that made Clint's stomach churn. "You're always so predictable, Clint. You think you're the only one who can disappear. You think you're the only one who knows how to survive. This world is ours now. People like you and me, we're relics. But people like me, we know how to adapt. How to evolve." Clint's fingers flexed around the grip of his gun, but he held back. He needed information, not a firefight, not yet. He needed to figure out who Liam was working for, what the full scope of this operation really was. "I never wanted to be part of this world again, Liam," Clint said, his voice tight. "But you had to drag me back into it. What are you after? What is Operation Echo really about?" Liam's eyes glinted with something dark, something Clint couldn't quite place. "You think you're the only one who's trying to change things? You think this is just about power, Clint? This is about control. It's about rewriting the rules. And you're a part of that whether you like it or not." Clint narrowed his eyes. "You don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't just a game. People's lives are at stake." Liam's smile widened. "That's the point, Clint. People's lives are the currency. Control. Influence. The things you used to fight for are exactly what I'm building, only bigger. This isn't just about domination. It's about shaping the future." Clint clenched his jaw. He had heard this rhetoric before, from those who believed they could reshape the world by pulling the strings from the shadows. But Clint knew better than to let their words cloud his judgment. You're a fool if you think you can control everything. People will rise up. They always do. Liam laughed, the sound hollow. You think you can stop this? You're too far gone, Clint. There's no going back now. We're already in motion. Clint's mind was racing, but he refused to let Liam see how shaken he was. This was no longer just about Cruise or even Operation Echo. This was about something much larger, something Clint was now fully entrenched in, whether he liked it or not. Then I guess I'll just have to make sure you don't get what you want. Liam tilted his head, almost amused. Good luck with that, Clint. The game has already begun. Clint's fingers tightened around the gun. The man before him was a ghost from his past, a reminder of the world Clint had tried so hard to leave behind. But it was clear now that there was no escaping it. He had been pulled back into the fight, and he wasn't about to back down. The only question now was how deep the rabbit hole went, and how far Clint was willing to go to stop Liam and his shadowy allies from changing the world forever. Clint stood motionless in the dark room, his gaze locked on Liam, the man who had once been a colleague but now felt like a ghost from the past. The tension in the air was palpable. Clint's finger remained on the trigger, his mind racing, calculating the next step, trying to stay one move ahead of the man before him. Liam took a deliberate step forward, his hands casually slipping into his pockets, as if he wasn't facing off with a man who had once been a part of his life, a man who knew the same tricks, played the same deadly games. You think you can stop this, Clint? Liam's voice was cold, with an edge of amusement. You're too late. Operation Echo is already in motion, and there's no going back now. Clint's jaw clenched. You've underestimated me, Liam. You think you can control everything, but you're wrong. You can't just erase the past or the people who fight for what's right. Liam chuckled softly, his eyes narrowing. Right and wrong are just concepts. What's real, Clint, is power. Power is what shapes the future. People like you, people who think they can hold on to their morals and ideals, are nothing but obstacles. Clint could feel the weight of his own frustration simmering beneath the surface. He knew the kind of world Liam was trying to create, one of complete control, a world where freedom was a distant memory, and power was the only currency that mattered. Clint had been part of that world once, but he'd escaped it. He'd learned the hard way what it meant to be a pawn in someone else's game, and he wasn't about to let that happen again. I'm not here to play by your rules, Clint said, his voice steady but laced with defiance. I've already been down that road. I'm not afraid of you, Liam. Not anymore. Liam's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's the difference between you and me, Clint. You still believe in the illusion of choice. You still think you can make a difference. But I've seen it all. There's no escaping the truth anymore. People like me, we don't need to hide in the shadows. The world is ours to control now. The walls of the small room seemed to close in on Clint, the weight of Liam's words pressing against him. But Clint had been in darker places than this. He had faced worse odds and had come out on top. He wasn't going to let Liam win. With a swift movement, Clint lowered the gun slightly, his eyes never leaving Liam's. I've seen what you're capable of. You're not invincible. And I'm not walking away from this. The room was silent for a moment, the air thick with the tension between them. Clint knew he had to make a move. If he didn't, Liam's plans would succeed, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The people behind Operation Echo wouldn't just stop at controlling a few leaders, they would reshape the entire world order, erasing anyone who stood in their way. Suddenly, the faint hum of a security system came to life. A soft beep echoed through the room, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. Clint's eyes flicked to the door as a heavy metal panel began to slide open, revealing a group of masked men, their hands steady on the weapons at their sides. Liam's face hardened as he glanced toward the door. It's over, Clint. You're surrounded. Clint's mind raced. He didn't have the numbers on his side, but he did have something that Liam didn't: experience. With a single, fluid motion, Clint drew his weapon, firing 2 quick shots. The first hit one of the masked men square in the chest, while the second shot grazed another. The remaining operatives scrambled, trying to regroup, but Clint was already moving. He dashed toward the nearest cover, using the chaos to his advantage. Liam remained unmoving, his cold gaze fixed on Clint, as if he were merely observing the scene unfold. But Clint knew better. This wasn't over yet. Carter's voice suddenly crackled through the comms in Clint's ear, a welcome sound amidst the chaos. Clint, we've got your back. We've located the secondary exits. Head for the west side. We'll cover you. Clint didn't hesitate. With a nod, he quickly assessed the situation, using the distraction to slip out of the room and into the hallway. The adrenaline surged through his veins as he moved swiftly, his mind focused on one thing: getting out alive. The hallway was narrow, the walls lined with harsh fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. Clint could hear the footsteps of Liam's men behind him, closing in. But Clint wasn't just running. He was strategizing, looking for the right moment to make his move. Ahead, he saw a set of double doors, leading to the back exit. His heart raced as he darted toward them, but just as he reached for the door handle, he was met with another obstacle: 2 more operatives blocking his path, their guns drawn. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Clint's instincts kicked in as he dropped to the floor, sliding under their line of fire. The operatives fired, but Clint was already moving, rolling to his feet and taking them both down in one fluid motion. His body was a blur, moving with precision as he neutralized the threat and opened the door to freedom. But as Clint stepped into the dark alleyway outside, the full gravity of the situation hit him. He had survived, but the battle was far from over. He was just one man, up against a global network of power-hungry individuals. And yet, something in him refused to give up. The sound of sirens in the distance reminded him that the clock was ticking. There was no time to rest, no time to regroup. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, if they had any chance of taking down Operation Echo and exposing the people behind it. Clint's breath came in heavy gasps as he wiped the sweat from his brow. His mind raced through the next steps. He knew Liam wouldn't let him go that easily, and the men he had just taken down were only the beginning. Carter, get to the rendezvous point, Clint spoke into the comms, his voice steady despite the chaos. We need to get out of here before reinforcements arrive. Clint moved swiftly through the alley, his instincts sharp. The night was dark, but the lights from nearby buildings illuminated his path. The shadows seemed to stretch out before him, but Clint didn't falter. He had one goal now: stop Operation Echo before it was too late. As he made his way to the rendezvous point, Clint's mind couldn't help but drift back to Liam's words. The world is ours to control now. Clint gritted his teeth. No, it wasn't over. Not as long as he still had breath in his lungs. The game was far from over. But Clint had made one thing clear: he wasn't going down without a fight. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he sprinted through the winding alleyways of the city, the night air biting at his skin. The rendezvous point was close now, a small, quiet cafe tucked away from the main streets. It had been Carter's suggestion, unassuming and discreet, the perfect place to lay low while they regrouped. But Clint knew that the safety it promised was fleeting. The clock was ticking, and Operation Echo wasn't going to wait for them to catch their breath. The adrenaline was a double-edged sword. While it fueled him, sharpening his reflexes and keeping his mind focused, it also brought a sharp awareness of the danger closing in from all sides. The silence that hung over the city felt suffocating, broken only by the distant sounds of sirens and the occasional creak of old buildings shifting in the cool night air. Behind him, the pursuit had begun. Clint's instincts screamed that he was being hunted. He had been in situations like this before, but the stakes now were higher. The people chasing him weren't just ordinary operatives, they were trained, coordinated, and far more ruthless than any enemies he'd faced in the past. As he rounded a corner, Clint quickly glanced over his shoulder. The figure of a man emerged from the shadows, moving with precision and purpose. It wasn't just one operative, there were at least two, maybe three, following his every move. Clint had no intention of letting them catch up, but he also knew he couldn't outrun them forever. There was only one option left, fight or flee. The cafe was just ahead, its windows glowing softly in the dim streetlights. It seemed too perfect, too calm in comparison to the storm brewing around him. But Clint didn't have time to second-guess. He had to act fast. He burst through the door, causing the bell above it to jingle sharply as he stepped inside. Carter was already there, sitting in a corner booth, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The moment Clint entered, Carter's eyes darted to the door, then back to Clint. His expression was unreadable, but Clint could see the tension in his posture, the way his fingers twitched near his sidearm. "Trouble?" Carter asked in a low voice, his gaze flickering toward the door Clint had just entered through. "More than I expected," Clint muttered, slumping into the booth across from Carter. He kept his eyes on the door as he spoke, his mind racing. "They're closing in. I don't know how long we have." Carter didn't say anything at first. Instead, he reached under the table and pulled out a small, sleek device. He pressed a button, and the soft hum of the cafe's background noise was suddenly muted, replaced by a low, mechanical buzz. The privacy field had been activated, cutting off any chance of eavesdropping. Clint exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. "We're out of time. Liam won't stop coming for us. He's playing the long game, and I don't think we're even close to the end yet." Carter took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Clint's. "So what's the plan?" Clint's mind was already turning, formulating a course of action. The cafe was a temporary safe haven, but it wasn't a solution. They needed to get to the heart of Operation Echo, find the people pulling the strings, and take them down before it was too late. But Clint knew that would mean going head-to-head with Liam and whoever else was backing him. "We need to get to their central command," Clint said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I've been going through the files. It's bigger than we thought. Operation Echo isn't just a covert operation. It's a global network, with people embedded everywhere. We can't trust anyone." Carter leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "So, what's the first step?" Clint's eyes flicked toward the door again, hearing the faint sound of footsteps. They were close. Too close. "The first step is getting out of here alive," Clint said, his voice tight. "We need to move, now." Before Carter could respond, the door to the cafe creaked open, and two figures stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. Clint's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to reveal any hint of panic. The men walked to the counter and ordered drinks, their eyes lingering on Clint and Carter for just a moment too long. Clint's senses were on high alert now. These weren't just regular patrons. They were the ones hunting him. "We need a diversion," Clint whispered, leaning across the table toward Carter. "I'll take care of them. You head for the back exit. Don't stop for anything." Carter nodded without a word, his hand sliding under the table to grab his bag. He knew what needed to be done. The tension between them was palpable, but their years of working together had forged an unspoken bond. They didn't need to exchange words, each knew exactly what the other was thinking. Clint waited until Carter stood and made his way toward the back of the cafe, then turned his attention to the men who had entered. They were still pretending to be casual, but Clint could see the subtle signs, how their hands hovered near their jackets, how they scanned every inch of the room. They were waiting for the right moment to make their move. The cafe's bell jingled as the door opened once more, and Clint seized the opportunity. He stood quickly, his body shifting into a defensive stance, and made a beeline for the men. "Hey!" Clint called out, his voice sharp. The two men turned just in time to see Clint coming at them. Before they could react, Clint was on them. He grabbed one by the collar, using his momentum to slam the man into the counter. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of him, but Clint didn't stop. With a swift movement, he twisted the man's arm behind his back, forcing him to drop his weapon. The second man reacted faster, pulling out a gun and aiming it directly at Clint. But Clint was quicker, sidestepping and kicking the gun from the man's hand. The two men were outmatched, and within seconds, they were both disarmed and subdued, lying on the floor in a heap. Clint didn't have time to enjoy the victory. He bolted for the back exit, catching up with Carter, who was already outside in the alley, scanning the streets for any signs of pursuit. "We're clear for now," Carter said, his eyes darting from side to side. "But that won't last. We need to get moving." Clint nodded, his breath coming in short bursts. They had to keep pushing forward. There was no turning back now. Operation Echo had far too many resources at its disposal, and the people behind it weren't going to stop until they had complete control. "We head for the rendezvous point," Clint said. "We'll meet up with the team, regroup, and figure out our next move." As they slipped into the shadows, the weight of what they were up against became even clearer. Operation Echo wasn't just a mission, it was a war. And Clint knew that every step they took from here on out would bring them closer to the heart of a global conspiracy that would stop at nothing to control the future. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the world's future. Clint's pulse continued to race as he and Carter navigated the backstreets, their footsteps muffled by the worn pavement. The city was quiet tonight, eerily quiet. But Clint knew that peace was an illusion. The calm before the storm. They had narrowly escaped the cafe, but the enemy was relentless, and the chase was far from over. Their destination was a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was secure. The plan was simple: regroup, re-strategize, and prepare for the next phase. Operation Echo was vast, and Clint knew they needed to hit it at its core. But getting there wouldn't be easy. Every step was fraught with danger, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. As they turned a corner, Clint's eyes flicked to the alleyways, watching for movement. He wasn't sure if it was just paranoia or if his instincts were right, but something about tonight felt different. The enemy wasn't just pursuing them, they were closing in fast. "Clint," Carter's voice interrupted his thoughts. "We need to talk." "About Liam?" Clint slowed his pace, eyeing Carter. "What about him?" "I've been thinking about what he said earlier, about power," Carter continued, his voice low. "You know he's right, right? About how the world works now. We've both seen it. Power drives everything, every decision, every action. And if we're not careful, we're going to be just as lost as the rest of them." Clint stopped walking for a moment, considering Carter's words. He knew what Carter was getting at. The truth was, Clint had spent most of his life fighting against systems of control, against people like Liam. But even he had to admit, sometimes it felt like the world was tipping in their favor. Power was everything. And they were up against an invisible force, a network so large, so deep, that every time they made a move, it felt like they were playing checkers against someone who had mastered chess. "I get it," Clint said after a long pause. "But that's not why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this to get power. I'm doing this to stop them. To stop him. People like Liam don't stop until they have it all. They don't care who they crush to get there." Carter nodded slowly. "But how do we stop him? We're just two people. The whole world is playing a game, and we're just pawns in it." Clint looked up, his eyes hardening with determination. We may be pawns in their game, Carter, but we're not helpless. We have to keep pushing forward. It's the only thing we can do. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Carter finally spoke. Right. Keep pushing forward. They continued walking, the sense of urgency growing as they neared the warehouse. It wasn't just the threat of Liam's operatives they were up against anymore. They were up against the system, the entire network behind Operation Echo. Clint had no illusions about what they were up against. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a war, and Clint was all too aware that they couldn't afford to lose. The warehouse came into view, a hulking shadow against the night sky. It was an old, industrial building, tucked away from the main roads, far enough from prying eyes. This was where they would make their stand. This was where they would regroup and plan their next move. As they entered the building, Clint immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. The air inside was thick with dust, and the sounds of the city outside seemed to fade away. It was a haven for a moment, but Clint knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Inside, a few of the team members were already waiting. Lex, a tech specialist, was sitting at a makeshift workstation, his eyes glued to multiple screens displaying encrypted data. There was a tension in the air as he typed furiously, trying to crack the codes that held the key to Operation Echo. Clint, Lex said without looking up, I've been monitoring communications from their network. It's a mess. But it's also getting tighter. They're on to us. We're running out of time. Clint nodded grimly. I know. We need to find out where their command center is. We go straight for the heart of the operation. We've been trying to track it, Lex replied, his fingers still flying over the keyboard. But these people are good. They've covered their tracks, used multiple layers of encryption. The problem is, I can only break so many codes before they change their patterns. Do your best, Clint said, his voice firm. We need to know where to strike. Carter stepped up, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the screen. So, what's the plan, Clint? We can't just keep running around in circles. We need a solid lead. Clint paused for a moment, then turned to face the group. There's no more running. We know they're after us. We know they're not going to stop until we're gone. So, we make them stop. We hit them where it hurts. He paused again, his eyes sweeping over the team. They had been through a lot together. They had survived worse odds, but this time was different. This wasn't just a mission to take down an enemy, this was about saving the world from a future where people like Liam controlled everything. We're going to find their central hub, Clint said, his voice taking on a steely edge. Once we have that, we make them pay. We take it all down. No more games. A brief silence followed his words as the team absorbed what Clint had just said. Lex's fingers paused on the keyboard for a moment as he considered the weight of the decision. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'll do everything I can to find their location, Lex said. We don't have much time, Clint reminded them, his eyes hardening. Let's move. For a moment, the team was silent, each member processing the enormity of what lay ahead. They had been in tight spots before, but this was different. The stakes were higher, and the enemy they faced wasn't just a shadowy figure anymore, it was a vast, powerful force that could shape the world to its will. But Clint had been in situations like this before. He knew how to fight. He knew how to survive. And this time, he wasn't alone. Let's make sure this ends tonight, Clint said, his voice low and resolute. The team gathered their gear and began to prepare. As Clint looked out the warehouse's small, grimy window, he saw the lights of distant buildings twinkling like stars in the distance. The world outside was unaware of the war that was about to unfold. But Clint knew one thing for sure, they weren't going to let Liam and his operatives win. Not on their watch. They would fight. They would win. Or they would die trying. And as Clint took one last look at his team, he felt the weight of their resolve settle in his chest. The warehouse was filled with the soft hum of equipment, the only sound in the vast, cavernous space. Clint paced back and forth, his mind racing. Each step seemed to echo in the silence, a reminder that time was slipping away. Carter was at the back of the room, going over tactical maps, while Lex continued his relentless assault on the encrypted network. Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about taking down a rogue operation, it was about survival. And survival meant taking down the system at its core. He'd never been one to play by the rules, but this time, the rules had to be rewritten. This time, they had to play it smart. Lex finally broke the silence. His voice, though tinged with exhaustion, was steady. "I've got a lead," he said, eyes still focused on his screen. "It's not much, but it's enough to get us started. I've cracked part of their communications grid. The signal's coming from a location near the coast. It's heavily guarded, but it's a start." Clint felt a surge of hope rise in his chest, tempered with caution. "Good. How soon can we get there?" Lex turned away from his screen, wiping his tired eyes. "We can move in 2 hours, but it's not going to be easy. The location is well protected, and the network we're dealing with is sophisticated. It'll be a scramble just to get in and out." Carter looked up from his map and nodded. "We're used to scrambles. What's the plan for getting past their security?" Clint thought for a moment. This was the moment where everything could go sideways, but he had no intention of letting that happen. "We go in quiet, take them by surprise. We've got the element of stealth on our side. No comms, no signals, we're ghosts." He turned to Lex. "How long do you think you can keep them from realizing we've infiltrated?" Lex adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowing as he processed the question. "With the right kind of interference, maybe an hour. After that, it gets tricky. They'll start scanning for anomalies." "An hour is enough," Clint said firmly. "We get in, take down what we need, and get out before they even know we're there." Carter looked satisfied with the plan, but Clint could see the same weariness in his eyes that he felt himself. The journey they were on had taken its toll. But there was no turning back now. They were so close, too close to fail. After another round of checks and preparations, the team set out. The 2-hour window that Lex had mentioned was a blessing, giving them just enough time to get into position. But the tension in the air was palpable, each of them aware that the real danger was still ahead. They had no idea how many people were waiting for them at the target location, how deep the web of security really went. Clint and Carter took the lead, moving through the dark streets with a purpose, staying in the shadows, avoiding the main roads. They couldn't afford to be seen, not with what they had planned. As they reached the outskirts of the city, the first signs of dawn began to appear on the horizon, casting a faint glow over the landscape. The coast was close now. Clint's gut twisted in anticipation. He could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. The coast was sparsely populated, save for the industrial complexes and warehouses that dotted the area. Lex had pinpointed a particular warehouse on the far side, just beyond a secluded stretch of beach. The place was an obvious stronghold. It was too well fortified to be just another supply station. This was the heart of Operation Echo. They approached the target with caution, moving silently over the rocky terrain that led toward the compound. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below provided a strange, almost eerie soundtrack to their mission. Everything about this felt wrong, like a storm was building just beneath the surface. Clint gestured for the team to halt as they neared the outer perimeter of the compound. He studied the security setup through a pair of binoculars. Motion sensors, cameras, armed guards patrolling the area, this wasn't going to be easy. "We'll need to take out the guards quietly, one by one," Clint whispered, his eyes never leaving the compound. "Carter, you're with me. Lex, you'll stay here and monitor the signals. If they catch wind of us, we're done." We need to keep our movements clean. Carter gave a sharp nod, his face grim. Got it. Stay in touch, Clint added before he motioned for Carter to follow him. They crouched low, blending into the shadows of the surrounding buildings as they made their way toward the compound's perimeter. The guards were patrolling in a predictable pattern, their footsteps crunching on gravel, their voices low and indistinct. Clint had studied their movements, calculating the best moments to strike. They couldn't afford to be sloppy. One mistake, and the entire mission would be compromised. Clint and Carter moved like shadows, quick and deliberate. The first guard was taken down silently, a swift move that left the man unconscious before he even had time to react. They dragged him out of view, hiding him behind a nearby stack of crates. They repeated the process, moving in and out of the shadows, always a step ahead. The compound security was strong, but Clint had always excelled in situations like this. He knew how to read people, how to predict their movements. And with Carter by his side, they made a formidable team. As they neared the entrance to the main building, Clint's comms crackled to life. It was Lex. They're starting to notice something's off, Lex warned. I'm seeing unusual traffic on their network. You need to hurry up. Clint didn't need to be told twice. They'd bought themselves some time, but that was running out. He motioned for Carter to take the lead, and together, they approached the main door. Lex had disabled most of the electronic locks, but there were still manual security systems in place. Clint pulled out a small device from his bag, a cutting-edge tool designed to bypass high-tech locks. He attached it to the door's security panel, watching as the screen blinked and flickered. The door clicked open with a quiet hiss. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Clint's eyes scanned the interior, noting the dimly lit hallway stretching out before them. This was it. The heart of Operation Echo. The place where everything they had worked for had led them. They stepped inside, weapons ready. The door slid closed behind them with a final, ominous thud. The silence inside the building was deafening. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he motioned for Carter to follow him. Every step took them deeper into enemy territory. And with every step, the world they knew was slipping further from their control. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a fight for everything that mattered. As they moved deeper into the heart of the compound, Clint knew that whatever lay ahead, they couldn't turn back. It was all or nothing now. The corridor seemed endless, stretching forward into darkness, the only sounds their footsteps and the soft whir of machines hidden behind the walls. Clint's senses were on high alert, his every instinct telling him to stay focused. Carter was beside him, every inch of his body as tense as a wire, ready for anything. The silence in the compound felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Whatever lay ahead, it was going to be their hardest challenge yet. The hallway branched off into several rooms, some with doors wide open, others tightly shut. Clint's eyes darted between them, calculating his next move. He didn't want to waste any time, every second they spent in here was a second closer to being discovered. Lex, you still with us? Clint whispered into his comm. Yeah, I'm tracking you, Lex's voice came through, barely a whisper on the other end. You're heading toward the central operations room. It's where all the data is being processed. There are only 2 guards ahead. You're clear for now. Clint nodded, even though Lex couldn't see him. 2 guards. We'll take care of it. The map in Clint's head ran like a blueprint. The central operations room was just up ahead. It was their target. It was where the true control of Operation Echo lay, and once they were inside, they'd have access to everything, the plans, the networks, the names behind the operation. This was the information they needed to bring the entire thing down. He signaled to Carter, who quietly readied his weapon, eyes scanning for movement. They crept closer to the corner where they knew the guards would be stationed. The first guard was pacing back and forth, while the other stood against the wall, checking his phone. They were distracted, but Clint knew better than to assume they were easy targets. One wrong move, and they'd be all over them. Clint and Carter's strategy was simple: isolate the guards, neutralize them silently, and move on. They couldn't afford to make a sound. Carter took the first guard, slipping up behind him, a swift hand to the throat. The guard went down without a fight, barely a sound escaping him. Clint dealt with the second guard quickly, a shot to the back of his neck, followed by a soft shove that sent the body crumpling to the floor. They moved the bodies into the nearest room, out of sight. 2 down. "How are we looking, Lex?" Clint asked. "You're still clear, but I've detected some movement toward the east side," Lex replied. "They're starting to scramble. You have minutes at most before they lock down the building." Clint didn't hesitate. They were running out of time. He and Carter sprinted the remaining distance to the central operations room. The door was heavy, reinforced with steel, but Clint knew it was nothing they couldn't handle. He pulled out another device from his pack, sliding it into the door's security system and quickly bypassing the code. The lock clicked, and with a single push, the door swung open. Inside, the operations room was nothing like Clint had imagined. The walls were lined with screens, large monitors displaying streams of encrypted data, satellite imagery, maps of various countries. The room hummed with the quiet energy of machinery working at full capacity. But Clint's eyes were focused on the main console in the center of the room, the one that held the key to everything they needed. "Get to the console," Clint said, his voice low but firm. Carter moved without hesitation, making his way to the console and immediately beginning to work on the system. Meanwhile, Clint scanned the room, his hand hovering near his weapon. The last thing they needed now was an ambush. "Lex," Clint whispered. "Any sign of backup?" "Not yet, but they're mobilizing," Lex replied. "I've got eyes on a few more guards on the way. They'll be there in 3 minutes." Clint's mind raced. 3 minutes. That wasn't a lot of time. He couldn't afford to think about the odds, he had to trust in Carter's ability to get the data they needed. The plan had always been to strike fast, strike hard, and leave before they could be overwhelmed. Carter's fingers flew over the console, his focus laser-sharp. Clint couldn't hear the tapping of keys over the thudding in his chest, but he knew Carter was deep in it. This was their shot. Clint turned his attention back to the door, scanning for any sign of movement. The seconds ticked by slowly, but every second felt like an eternity. He wasn't sure how much time they had left, but he was certain that it wouldn't be long before someone noticed they'd breached the heart of the operation. The door slid open suddenly, and Clint's body went rigid. 2 guards stepped inside, their hands reaching for their weapons. "Get down!" Clint shouted to Carter. Without thinking, Clint's gun was already raised, a shot fired in quick succession, each guard hitting the floor before they had time to react. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Clint exhaled, his pulse racing as he checked their vitals. They were out cold. "Keep working, Carter," Clint ordered. Carter didn't look up, but the slight tilt of his head told Clint that he had heard him loud and clear. As Clint turned back to the door, a low buzz filled the air, followed by a loud mechanical whir. A security alarm. They'd been compromised. "Lex!" Clint barked. "We need an extraction point. Now." "I'm sending the coordinates," Lex replied urgently. "You'll have to move fast. The building's on lockdown in 2 minutes. You've got to get out before they seal all exits." Clint's stomach dropped. 2 minutes. He turned back to Carter, who was still furiously typing into the console, his expression intense. Clint could see the tension building in his eyes. This wasn't just about hacking into a system, this was about cracking a code that could bring down everything, exposing the truth of Operation Echo. It was the only thing that could stop Liam and his network. But the clock was ticking. "Come on, Carter," Clint muttered to himself. Finally, Carter looked up, a brief flicker of triumph in his eyes. Got it. Before Clint could say anything, Carter hit the final key. A list of files appeared on the screen, the names and locations of key players in the operation, along with their plans for the future. The data they needed. The data that could bring the entire operation to its knees. Clint grabbed the hard drive that Carter handed him, feeling the weight of what they now had in their hands. "We've got it," Clint said, his voice steady but his heart pounding. The alarm blared louder now, echoing through the hallways, signaling that they had no more time to waste. They had to move. "We're out of here," Clint said, leading Carter toward the back exit. The building was starting to buzz with activity. They needed to get to the extraction point before they were trapped inside. Clint and Carter darted down the hallway, weapons drawn. There was no more time to waste. The plan had worked, just barely. But now, they were about to take the fight to Liam and his people. The final battle was coming, and they weren't going to stop until they'd brought the whole operation down. It was now or never. The extraction point was a mile away, but every step felt like an eternity. The alarm blared through the compound, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. Clint's mind was racing as he led Carter through the maze of hallways. He could hear the sound of footsteps echoing behind them, guards mobilizing, scrambling to figure out what had happened, and how they'd gotten in so easily. The central operations room had been a success, but that success was fleeting. Now, they were deep in enemy territory, with limited time to make it out alive. "Lex, you tracking us?" Clint whispered into his comm as he rounded a corner, Carter following close behind. "I'm here." "You've got company," Lex replied, his voice tight with tension. "2 squads of guards are converging on your position. They'll be there in 1 minute." Clint's heart skipped a beat. 1 minute. That wasn't enough time to make it out without a fight. His instincts kicked in, and he motioned for Carter to stop. They crouched down behind a set of crates, their breathing shallow, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The sound of footsteps grew louder, signaling that the guards were getting closer. Clint peeked around the crates and saw the shadows of 2 men moving down the hallway. He quickly analyzed the situation. There was no way they could outrun these guards, not in a confined space like this. They would have to fight. His hand went to his holster, fingers brushing against the cool metal of his gun. He wasn't afraid of fighting. But there were still 2 squads to deal with, and no matter how skilled they were, they couldn't take on an entire building full of armed personnel. "Carter," Clint whispered, voice low and controlled, "I need you to cover me. We'll take the first 2 guards, then move fast." Carter gave him a sharp nod, his eyes dark with determination. "Got it." Clint's mind worked quickly. He waited for the right moment, watching as the guards came closer, unaware of the danger that was lurking just beyond their sight. His finger hovered over the trigger, ready to strike. The first guard passed within a few feet, his back turned. Clint moved swiftly, silently, and in a single fluid motion, he struck. His gun was raised, and before the guard had time to react, Clint fired, the shot echoing in the otherwise silent hall. The guard crumpled to the floor, and Clint moved to the second guard. Carter was already on it. He'd taken the other guard down with a chokehold, his body moving with the efficiency of someone who had been in countless fights before. Clint nodded in approval, but there was no time to waste. They dragged the guards out of sight, hiding them behind the crates. The sound of more footsteps grew louder, and Clint's heart raced. They had to move, fast. Clint motioned for Carter to follow him, and they took off down the hallway again, their pace swift and deliberate. The plan was simple: get to the extraction point, retrieve the vehicle, and get the hell out of there before they were surrounded. Lex's voice crackled through the comms again. "They've sealed off the main exits. You'll need to take the secondary route to the south. I'm marking it on your map now." Clint's gaze flicked to the digital map on his wrist. The secondary route wasn't as secure, but it was the only option they had now. He glanced at Carter, who was already 2 steps ahead, a determined look in his eyes. They pushed forward, turning another corner, and Clint could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins. They were getting closer to the exit, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every corner they rounded, every door they passed, Clint half expected to see a squad of guards waiting for them. "Keep moving, Carter," Clint said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're almost there." The building seemed to get darker as they neared the secondary exit. The security systems were designed to funnel people toward the main exits, not the back routes, which gave Clint a slight sense of reassurance. But the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. It was too quiet, too calm. As they rounded the final corner, they came face to face with a set of reinforced doors leading to the secondary exit. Clint stopped dead in his tracks, eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. "Carter, cover me," Clint muttered, reaching for the door's security panel. His fingers moved quickly, entering the bypass code that Lex had sent. The door's locks clicked, but before it could open, Clint heard something that made his blood run cold. A sound of heavy boots. A lot of them. The hair on the back of Clint's neck stood up. The guards weren't just in the building, they were surrounding it. They'd anticipated their every move. They were trapped. "Lex, we've got a problem," Clint said, his voice tight with tension. "The secondary route is compromised." "I see it," Lex responded, sounding equally alarmed. "The perimeter's been locked down. You're not getting out that way. You'll need to find another way." Another way. Clint's mind raced. There was no more time for subtlety. They had no choice but to fight their way out. "We'll take the rooftop," Clint decided, a fierce resolve settling over him. "Get ready. We're not giving up that easy." Clint slammed his shoulder into the door, pushing it open just enough to slip through. The air outside was cold, and the sound of distant gunfire echoed in the distance, signaling that the situation had escalated. He scanned the rooftop and found a ladder that led up to the next level of the building. "We're going up," Clint said, already sprinting toward the ladder. Carter was right behind him, covering their backs. But as they reached the top, the sight that greeted them wasn't what Clint had hoped for. The compound was surrounded, dozens of heavily armed guards were positioned around the perimeter, their weapons trained on the rooftop. There was no escaping that way either. Clint's pulse quickened. There was nowhere to go. They were boxed in. He turned to Carter, their eyes meeting for the briefest of moments. In that look, Clint saw the same realization, the same recognition, that this wasn't just about getting out alive anymore. It was about fighting for what mattered. "Lex," Clint said into the comm, his voice now a low growl. "We need an extraction, and we need it now." "I'm on it," Lex replied. "It's going to be tight, but I've got a chopper en route." "Hold your position." Hold their position. Clint didn't have time for that. The sound of approaching footsteps thundered through the roof, and Clint felt the unmistakable presence of enemies closing in from every direction. It was now or never. They had to fight. Clint's eyes scanned the rooftop, his mind racing through possible escape routes. But there was no way out, no quick way to disappear into the night like he had done so many times before. This time, they were cornered. Surrounded. And they had no choice but to make their last stand. He turned to Carter, who was already setting up for whatever was coming next. Carter was a man of action, never one to dwell on the odds. He didn't have time to think about how they had gotten here. He was already in fight mode. Clint knew what Carter was thinking. It wasn't about running anymore. It was about surviving. And they weren't about to go down without a fight. "We'll hold them off as long as we can," Clint said, his voice steady. "Get ready." The sound of boots clanging against the metal of the rooftop echoed through the night. Clint could hear the click of weapons being readied, rifles, pistols, and the unmistakable hum of military-grade equipment. They were ready for this. The question was, were Clint and Carter? "Lex," Clint said, his voice low, "how much longer until the chopper gets here?" 2 minutes, Lex replied. "You've got to hold them off until then. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep the perimeter secure." Clint's eyes darted to Carter, who was already peering over the edge of the rooftop, eyes locked on the ground below, where the guards were starting to assemble. It wouldn't be long before they had them surrounded on all sides. 2 minutes, Clint muttered to himself. It didn't seem like much time, but in this situation, every second counted. They had to hold the line. He quickly took stock of their weapons. They had enough ammo to make a dent, but not to fight a full-on battle. No matter how skilled they were, they couldn't hold off an entire battalion of soldiers forever. They'd need a plan. "Carter, you take the left flank," Clint said, his voice steady and commanding. "I'll cover the right. We'll create a kill zone in the middle, make them funnel in. Stay sharp." Carter nodded. "Got it." Without another word, they split, each moving to their designated position. Clint crouched behind a metal vent on the edge of the roof, his gun ready in his hands, his breathing controlled. The adrenaline was surging now, but he couldn't afford to let his heart race too fast. The moment he lost control of his nerves, that was when he'd make a mistake. And mistakes could cost them their lives. The guards were moving closer. Clint could see their shadows stretch out across the rooftop as they spread out, preparing to storm the building. He could hear their whispers, their commands, the heavy clinking of equipment. He focused on the sound of their footsteps. It was only a matter of time before they saw them. He had to be ready. Then, out of nowhere, the unmistakable sound of a helicopter sliced through the night sky. "Lex," Clint breathed, feeling the tension lift for a moment. "It's here." "Hold on just a little longer," Lex replied, his voice barely audible over the noise of the chopper's blades. "They're already closing in on the building. You're going to have to move fast when the ropes drop." The helicopter's engines roared, the noise growing louder with each passing second. Clint's eyes flicked to the sky, searching for the first sign of the ropes. But the guards had other plans. The first wave came from the right. Clint didn't wait for them to get closer. He fired, a sharp burst of gunfire slicing through the air. The first 2 guards fell, but they weren't the only ones. More followed, charging toward the rooftop, their weapons raised. "Carter!" Clint yelled, knowing that Carter would have to take the left side on his own for a moment. "I'm on it." Carter called back, his voice steady as he unloaded on the advancing guards. Clint's heart pounded in his chest as he continued to fire. Each shot was calculated, each movement deliberate. He couldn't afford to miss. Not now. Not when their lives were on the line. The noise of gunfire and shouting filled the air. The rooftop became a battleground. Clint ducked behind cover, reloading his weapon quickly as more and more guards poured onto the roof. They were outnumbered, but they were fighting with everything they had. Then, the first rope dropped from the helicopter, swinging toward Clint's position. "Clint! Get to the rope!" Lex's voice crackled through the comms. "It's now or never." Clint glanced at Carter, who had taken cover behind a nearby air conditioning unit. Carter was holding his own, but they both knew they couldn't keep this up much longer. It was time to move. "Carter!" Clint shouted, his voice sharp over the chaos. "We've got to go, now." Carter didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward Clint, dodging bullets and debris, his body moving with purpose. He reached Clint's side just as more guards appeared on the far side of the roof. "Let's move!" Clint shouted, grabbing Carter's arm. They ran toward the rope, their feet pounding against the metal rooftop. More shots rang out, and Clint could feel the wind of a bullet pass dangerously close to his head. But there was no turning back now. The rope was their only chance. Clint reached the edge of the roof first, grabbing hold of the rope with one hand while pulling Carter up with the other. Climb! Clint ordered, urgency in his voice. Carter was right behind him, his hand gripping the rope tightly as they both began to ascend. The helicopter was already hovering above, the powerful blades creating a turbulent wind that made the climb even harder. Clint's arms burned from the effort, but he didn't stop. He could hear the guards behind them, closing in fast. But the chopper was almost at the top. They were almost there. "Hang on, Clint!" Lex shouted from the helicopter, his voice filled with relief. "We've got you." Clint's hand reached the edge of the helicopter's door, and with a final burst of strength, he swung himself up, pulling Carter along with him. The helicopter's doors slammed shut just as a hail of gunfire rang out, but they were safely inside. Clint collapsed into the seat, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building since the moment they set foot on this mission. The chopper veered away from the building, climbing higher into the night sky. Below them, the compound grew smaller, the chaos slowly fading into the distance. Clint let out a deep breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. They had made it. But this was far from over. They had the data. They had the key to destroying Operation Echo. And now, they were going to bring the fight to Liam, and everyone else involved. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. And Clint would stop at nothing to see it done. The helicopter's roar faded into the distance as Clint leaned back, trying to catch his breath. The adrenaline that had coursed through him only moments ago was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a hollow, exhausted feeling. He glanced at Carter, who was wiping sweat from his brow and checking his weapon for damage. Despite their escape, the danger hadn't passed. Lex's voice came through the comm, bringing Clint back to focus. "You made it out alive, but that's just the beginning. We've got a long road ahead of us." "Tell me about it," Clint muttered, rubbing his temples. "What's the status on the data?" Lex hesitated for a moment. "The data's safe for now, but it's more than just information. It's encrypted, and it's buried deep within the system. We need to crack it open before anyone realizes it's gone. I'm talking about Operation Echo. Whoever's behind it, they're not going to stop until they get it back." Clint's eyes narrowed. "I don't plan on giving it back. We're going to end this, once and for all." "I'm with you," Carter chimed in, his voice steady. "But where do we start? We've got the intel, but Liam's network runs deep. We need to find the right people to help us break it." Clint glanced at him, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's why we're not going after Liam directly just yet. We need to go underground." Lex's voice crackled again. "You're talking about the deep web, aren't you?" "Exactly," Clint replied. "Liam's network has tentacles everywhere. But the real players are hidden in the shadows. If we're going to bring this down, we need the people who know how to navigate that world. We need to find a hacker who can crack this data wide open." "Be careful," Lex warned. "The deep web is a dangerous place. You never know who's watching, who's listening." "I've never been afraid of the dark," Clint said with a chuckle, though there was little humor in his voice. "We'll take the necessary precautions." The chopper soared through the night, cutting across the city skyline like a ghost in the wind. Below, the urban jungle pulsed with life, oblivious to the war being fought just above it. Clint's thoughts raced, but there was no turning back now. Operation Echo had to end, and he was going to make sure that no one else suffered because of it. The next few hours were a blur as Clint, Carter, and Lex set up their operations. They relocated to a safe house, a small, unassuming apartment in the heart of the city, hidden in plain sight. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. Their resources were limited, but Clint knew that it was just a matter of time before they made the right connections. Carter had taken to scouting the area, checking for any signs of surveillance or interest. He moved like a shadow, blending into the surroundings, always alert. Meanwhile, Clint sat in front of a makeshift workstation, his eyes locked on the screen. Lex had arranged a meeting with a contact who specialized in navigating the deep web. Her name was Elara, and she had a reputation for being able to find anything and anyone, no matter how deep the rabbit hole went. If anyone could help them break through the encryption, it was her. Clint had his doubts. The world of the deep web was full of dangerous players, criminals, hackers, mercenaries. But it was also where the truth about Operation Echo would be buried, and Clint wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. After what felt like an eternity of tense silence, a message popped up on the screen, Elara. Clint's fingers hovered over the keys as he read the message. I have what you need. Meet me at the old warehouse by the docks. 3 a.m. sharp. Be prepared for anything. A chill ran down Clint's spine as he read the last line. He didn't like the vague warning, but it was all they had. There was no turning back now. He glanced over at Carter, who had just returned from his reconnaissance. We've got a meeting, Clint said, his voice low. 3 a.m., at the docks. A contact named Elara. Carter raised an eyebrow. The deep web? Exactly. We get in, get the intel, and get out. No distractions, no delays. I don't like it, Carter said, his tone serious. The deep web's a wild place. Anyone who wants to meet at the docks at 3 a.m., well, that's never a good sign. I know, Clint replied, but it's our best shot. If she can help us break this code, we need to take it. We'll be ready for whatever comes our way. The streets of the city were eerily quiet as they made their way to the docks. The only sound was the hum of the night wind and the distant lapping of the waves against the pier. Clint and Carter moved through the shadows, staying low, watching for any signs of movement. It felt like the world had gone to sleep, but Clint knew better. The real dangers only came out when the sun went down. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the inky sky. The large metal doors were slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered inside. Clint's instincts kicked in, but he remained calm. If they were going to meet Elara, they needed to play this right. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. As they approached the entrance, Clint motioned for Carter to stay back. He slipped inside first, his gun ready, his senses heightened. The air inside was musty, thick with the smell of rust and old wood. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Anyone here? Clint's voice was a low whisper as he surveyed the space. There was no sign of Elara yet, but he knew better than to assume they were alone. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner, and a figure stepped into the light. It was a woman, tall and dressed in black, her face obscured by a hood. She was carrying a laptop bag, which she set down on a nearby table. I see you made it, she said, her voice calm, but with a sharp edge to it. Clint didn't lower his gun. You Elara? The woman nodded, her eyes scanning them both before settling on Clint. I am. And you're Clint Eastwood, the one who's been making waves. I didn't expect you to be so, hands-on. But you're here now, so I guess we get down to business. Clint didn't trust her. He didn't trust anyone in this game, but right now, Elara was their best shot. We need the encryption broken. We have data that could take down a dangerous network. If you help us, we help you. Simple as that. Elara's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Simple, yes. But not without risks. What makes you think you're ready for what's next? Clint stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. Because we don't have a choice. For a moment, Elara said nothing. She just stared at him, as if sizing him up, before finally nodding. All right, then. Let's see if you're ready. And with that, they began. Elara flipped open her laptop with an almost nonchalant precision. Her fingers danced across the keys, moving with an unsettling familiarity, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The dim light from the single bulb overhead caught the edges of her face, casting deep shadows, but Clint could see the cool, calculating look in her eyes. She was a professional, no doubt about it. "All right," she said, her voice clipped, "let's get one thing straight. I'm helping you because I want something in return. The code you want to crack. It's not just a key to some low-level government secrets. This is next-level encryption, and it's tied to people who don't just vanish in the shadows. They own the shadows." Clint didn't flinch. He had heard the rumors. People like Liam didn't just walk away, they buried themselves so deep in the underworld that getting to them was like trying to extract a needle from a haystack. But Clint had never been one to shy away from danger. If Alara could crack this, they could finally put an end to Operation Echo. They could shut down the network before it spread any further. "I'm not interested in your terms, Alara," Clint said, his tone hard. "You help us crack this, and you get what you want. After that, we're done. No strings." Alara raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her attention back to the screen, her fingers flying over the keys. Clint and Carter exchanged a brief glance. There was tension in the air, but it wasn't just because of Alara's cryptic words, it was the weight of the situation. They were about to step into something much bigger than themselves. "I'm assuming you're ready for this," Alara said, not looking up. "Because once we break through the encryption, there's no going back. You'll know who's involved. You'll know what they've done. And the people you'll go up against won't show any mercy. Are you ready to live with that?" Clint took a breath. "There's no choice now, is there?" The sound of her typing slowed for a moment, then picked up again. "No. But you might wish you had one." The atmosphere in the warehouse felt thick, almost suffocating. The old wood creaked as a breeze moved through the space, the faint sound of water lapping against the nearby dock echoing in the distance. The stillness of the room was broken only by the rapid tapping of keys and the occasional flicker of the screen. Time seemed to slow as Alara worked, her focus unbroken. Carter paced the room, his gun always at the ready. Clint stayed closer to Alara, watching as she navigated the encrypted files. This was their moment. Everything depended on Alara's ability to crack this code. Minutes passed, then hours, and Clint began to feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. He had to admit that there was a certain unease about being in this kind of place. But he couldn't afford distractions. Not now. "Got it," Alara said, breaking the silence. She didn't even look up from the screen, her voice steady, but with an underlying satisfaction. Clint moved in closer, watching the screen as a complex web of data unraveled before his eyes. Names, locations, encrypted communications, financial transactions, the network was vast. The breadth of Operation Echo was far more extensive than they had anticipated. Clint's stomach sank as the depth of the conspiracy unfolded before him. "This isn't just about a few rogue operatives," Clint muttered, eyes scanning the data. "This goes all the way to the top." Alara glanced up briefly, a sharp look in her eyes. "Told you. You have no idea who you're dealing with. This is bigger than any of you think." Clint's mind was already racing. The names flashing across the screen were a who's who of power brokers, military figures, politicians, people Clint would never have suspected in 1,000 years. They were all tied together in a web of corruption, manipulating world events for profit, control, and power. Operation Echo wasn't just a military operation. It was the linchpin in a global network of influence that spanned continents. Carter moved closer, peering over Clint's shoulder at the screen. "This isn't just a rogue operation, is it? It's a whole system. A system that's been running without anyone realizing it." Clint nodded grimly. "Exactly. And Liam is the one pulling the strings from the shadows." Alara's voice cut through their thoughts. "Liam isn't the only one pulling the strings. He's a player in this game, but he's not the mastermind. You're looking at a web of influence that's been carefully constructed over years. It's not just about corruption, it's about control. The kind of control that lets them dictate world events, manipulate governments, and shape the future for their own gain. Clint absorbed her words, trying to process the sheer magnitude of it all. So what now? He asked. Elara didn't hesitate. Now, you make a choice. You can walk away from all of this and live your life, or you can take the fight to them and risk everything. But know this, if you take the latter option, you'll never be able to go back to the way things were. Clint exchanged a look with Carter. It was an unspoken agreement. They had already made their choice the moment they had intercepted the data. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about preventing this shadow network from gaining even more power. They had the information. Now, they needed to act before it was too late. We don't back down, Clint said, his voice firm. Elara nodded, seemingly satisfied. All right. But remember, once you start this, there's no turning back. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, checking the message. It was from Lex. The enemy knows we're coming. I've intercepted a transmission. They're mobilizing forces to stop you. You're running out of time. Move fast. Clint's face hardened. The moment had arrived. There was no time for hesitation. Carter, get ready, Clint said. We're going after them now. No more waiting. Carter checked his gun one last time, then gave Clint a nod. Let's go. Time's running out. Elara stood up from her laptop, locking the screen with a password. I'm coming with you, she said simply. You'll need someone who knows how to navigate the shadows. Clint didn't argue. If Elara could help them get deeper into the heart of the conspiracy, she was an asset they couldn't afford to lose. As they made their way to the exit of the warehouse, Clint's mind was already running through their next move. They had the data. Now, it was time to use it. Time to bring the entire operation crashing down. The enemy had made their first move. It was time to make theirs. And Clint was ready for whatever came next. The city lights blurred as Clint, Carter, and Elara sped through the streets. The hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the tense silence of the car, each of them consumed with their own thoughts. The transmission from Lex had been clear, the enemy was moving fast, and they weren't just waiting around for Clint and his team to make their next move. They were preparing for war. Where are we going? Elara's voice broke through the quiet, sharp and focused as always. Clint glanced at her in the rearview mirror. We've got a few hours before they fully mobilize. But we're not going to their headquarters, not yet. We need a safe location to extract everything we can from this data. Lex has a contact who can help us get in deeper. Someone who can give us intel on their movement, their plans. Carter frowned. But how much of a head start do we really have? I don't trust this information. The fact that they already know we're onto them makes me nervous. Clint's grip tightened on the wheel. We move fast. We don't wait for them to catch up. We have the advantage because we know where to hit. We need to strike before they can organize a real defense. Lex is right about one thing, Elara added, her tone matter of fact, this operation is too big for one person to handle. You're not just fighting Liam now. You're fighting an entire system, a network that's embedded in governments, corporations, and military forces. If you really want to take this down, you need to cut off the head. Clint didn't respond immediately. He had considered going after Liam directly, after all, the man had been the face of the entire operation. But Elara was right. Liam wasn't the only one in play. If they were going to win, they needed to dismantle the network, piece by piece. Then we need a plan, Clint said finally. A full-on assault. But not yet. We'll gather what we can first. They drove through the night, heading toward a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It was the last place anyone would expect to find crucial information, but that's exactly why Lex's contact used it. Clint knew better than to trust just anyone, but Lex had vouched for this one. A hacker named Oliver, known for operating in the gray areas of the internet and working with some of the most powerful players in the world. When they arrived, the place was dark and empty. The only sign of life was the flickering neon sign above the door that read, "Access granted." They stepped out of the car, weapons ready, and made their way to the entrance. Elara led the way, her steps confident and sure. Clint and Carter flanked her as they entered the building. The air smelled faintly of dust and mildew, a stark contrast to the high-tech nature of the operation they were about to infiltrate. They moved quickly, checking every corner, their senses on high alert. As they made their way down a narrow hallway, a door at the end creaked open. Oliver, a wiry man in his early 30s with a messy shock of dark hair, stood in the doorway. His eyes were hidden behind thick glasses, but there was no mistaking the sharp intelligence behind them. He was exactly what Clint had expected, an odd blend of street smart and tech savvy, someone who knew how to get things done when the stakes were high. "You must be Clint Eastwood," Oliver said, his voice flat but with a hint of amusement. "I've heard a lot about you. Can't say I'm thrilled to be involved in all of this, but, well, you don't really have a choice, do you?" Clint didn't smile. "You have the access we need." Oliver didn't waste time on pleasantries. He turned and walked to a row of monitors lined up on the far wall. "Everything's here. But first, we need to be clear about something." He paused and turned around to face Clint. "You're asking me to help you fight a war. A war that could escalate quickly and spill over into places you don't want it to. This isn't a simple hack and dash. Once you go down this path, you're committing to something much bigger." "I'm well aware of what's at stake," Clint replied evenly. "And if we don't stop them now, the world as we know it will change. We're all in." Oliver studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll help you. But remember, this is a one-way trip. There's no turning back once you start digging into this mess." Clint nodded, his jaw set. "I'm ready. Let's get to it." Oliver didn't waste any more time. He connected his laptop to one of the monitors, and Clint and Carter leaned in to watch. The screen flickered, then populated with an encrypted database, a massive network of files that looked like a jumble of random characters, but Clint knew better. This was the heart of the conspiracy. It was here, hidden in the digital vaults, that everything they needed to bring Liam down was buried. Elara stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the screen. "You know, you're not the only one who's going to be looking at this," she said. "They'll come for us. It won't be long before they realize what we've done. If we're not careful, they'll shut this operation down before it even gets started." Clint's eyes were fixed on the screen, his mind working through the implications. "We need to move faster. Find what they're planning and shut it down before they can react." Oliver typed furiously, navigating the deep layers of security with ease. He muttered under his breath as he decoded the layers of encryption, each line of data revealing more about the operation's scope and reach. Finally, he stopped, staring at the screen in shock. "There it is. I can see everything. They're preparing to launch a series of coordinated attacks across the globe. Targeted strikes, major operations, this is bigger than I thought. This is a global war they're planning, and they're using your stolen intel as the trigger." Clint's pulse quickened. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle. "Where are they launching from?" Clint asked, his voice low. Oliver didn't hesitate. "It's a satellite network. The encrypted data you found, it was the last step before they could initiate their final phase. The countdown is already underway. If we don't stop them now, the consequences will be catastrophic." Clint slammed his fist against the table, anger boiling inside him. "How much time do we have?" Oliver's fingers flew over the keyboard again, calculating. He turned to Clint with a grim expression. "A few hours. Not much more." Clint didn't waste another second. We move now. Get everything we need, and let's take them down before they can put their plan into motion. With a sense of urgency like never before, the team sprang into action. There was no more hesitation, no more waiting. It was now or never. The final showdown had begun. The adrenaline was coursing through Clint's veins as the countdown clock on the screen ticked down relentlessly. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic clacking of Oliver's fingers as he worked faster than ever before. The minutes were slipping away. In less than an hour, the network would activate, and the global chaos that had been meticulously planned would unfold before their eyes. Clint wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. "We need to move," Clint said, his voice calm but determined. He was already slipping on his jacket, reaching for his weapon. The time for talking was over. It was time to act. Carter stood up and checked his gear. Elara was already at the door, her eyes scanning the darkened hallway beyond, the weight of their mission settling heavily on her shoulders. She glanced back at Clint and nodded once, a silent affirmation that they were ready to do whatever it took. Oliver looked up, his face tight with tension. "You're asking me to get you into their system. But I can't guarantee it's going to be clean. Once I start bypassing their firewalls, they'll know we're here." Clint didn't flinch. He knew the risks. But if they didn't stop them now, it was over for everyone. "We don't have time to be subtle. We have one shot." Oliver nodded, grimly accepting the responsibility. "Then I'll give you what you need. But you better be ready to move fast." They moved in a coordinated blur, each one of them slipping into their roles with practiced precision. Oliver got to work on the terminal, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Lines of code flashed before his eyes as he cracked the layers of security like peeling back the layers of an onion. Clint could see the strain on his face. Time was running out. "Almost there," Oliver muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. He was pushing himself to the limit. "I'm in." A sudden beep echoed in the room, a sharp, high-pitched sound that made everyone freeze for a moment. Clint's heart skipped a beat as Oliver's screen flickered and then displayed a map of global military installations. The satellite network was coming online. Clint clenched his fists. This was the moment they had been building toward. Every second now mattered. "We've got about 20 minutes, Oliver said, his voice strained. "Once the satellite systems sync, they'll be able to launch strikes from anywhere. All major points are already locked in." Elara's eyes flashed with recognition. "We need to find their control center. It's the only way to stop this. If we can destroy the satellite relay, we can stop the launch." Clint's mind worked fast. The satellite relay was in a remote facility, too far for a simple assault. But there was another way. The encrypted files that Elara had cracked open earlier gave them the locations of hidden substations, relay points where the network could be disabled. "We need to cut the network at the source," Clint said, turning to Carter. "We have one shot at this. You're with me. Elara, you stay with Oliver and get him out of here once we've shut it down. We don't have the luxury of hesitation." Carter nodded, checking his gun one final time. "Ready when you are." The three of them moved swiftly, leaving Oliver to finish his work behind them. The hacker didn't need to be told twice, he knew the stakes. The tension in the room was palpable as Clint, Carter, and Elara headed for the exit. The cold night air hit them as they stepped outside the building, the sound of their boots hitting the pavement sharp in the stillness. They were moving quickly, their minds focused, the weight of the mission pushing them forward. The adrenaline was still coursing through Clint's veins as the seconds ticked by. This was it. There was no turning back now. A few blocks down the road, a nondescript van was parked, its engine running. Lex was already waiting for them inside. "Time's up," Lex said, glancing at the watch on his wrist. His tone was low, but there was an edge to it, a reflection of the urgency they all felt. We've got to get to the facility before they trigger the satellite. If we're too late, it's over. Clint nodded, jumping into the passenger seat. Carter climbed in beside him, and Elara followed, her eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. Lex gunned the engine, and the van shot off into the night, the headlights cutting through the dark streets. As they sped toward the facility, Clint's mind raced through the plan again. There were two key targets, the main satellite relay hub, and the security control center. They would need to infiltrate quickly, disable the systems, and extract whatever intel they could to bring down the rest of the operation. It wasn't going to be easy. But Clint had never backed down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. The facility loomed ahead, a fortress in the middle of nowhere. High concrete walls surrounded it, topped with barbed wire. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their flashlights sweeping the ground. It was a heavily fortified location, and getting inside wouldn't be easy. Lex pulled the van to a stop a few hundred yards from the entrance, cutting the engine. "We'll have to move fast and quiet," he said. "We don't have time to play nice. Once we're in, we take down their security systems and access the central relay." Clint nodded, checking his weapon one last time. "Let's move." They approached the facility under the cover of darkness, their steps light and deliberate. Carter led the way, moving with a quiet efficiency that came from years of training. Elara followed close behind, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Clint was right behind her, his senses sharp, every part of him tuned to the danger they were about to face. They reached the wall, and Carter climbed the fence effortlessly, reaching down to help the others up. They quickly slipped through the shadows, using the cover of the night to avoid detection. Their target was the security center, a small building on the far side of the compound, but it was heavily guarded. They took out the guards swiftly, their movements coordinated and precise. Clint felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as they slipped past the final set of guards and entered the security building. Once inside, the real challenge began. Elara worked quickly to disable the security systems, her fingers flying over the console. Clint and Carter kept watch, alert for any signs of trouble. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity, but they couldn't afford to lose focus. Finally, Elara hit the final key, and the security grid shut down with a soft beep. "We're in," she said, breathless but determined. "Now, let's shut this thing down." Clint nodded, motioning for Carter to move out. They followed Elara down the narrow hallway, pushing forward with everything they had. Every moment counted. If they didn't stop the satellite network now, the world as they knew it would be plunged into chaos. They reached the central control room, and Clint's heart raced. The countdown was nearing 0. "Now or never," Clint muttered, his hand on the door. He kicked it open, and the final battle began. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?